Hello, and welcome to an overview of a rather tumultuous decade in American and world history, the 1960s. The 1960s began in America with a race for president and the first televised presidential debate. The candidates were here on the right: John F. Kennedy from the Democratic Party. He was a veteran of World War II who had a book published about his heroic exploits. He had served in the House of Representatives as well as a senator from Massachusetts, and he ran for president of the United States in 1960, the youngest person to run for and, spoiler, win the election to the presidency. He was also the first Roman Catholic to be elected president. His opponent on the left here was Richard Nixon, the vice president of the past president Dwight David Eisenhower. They met in the fall of 1960 for the first of what would be many to come televised debates. John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, handsome, he did very well in the debate. Nixon had been ill, broke his knee on the way in. He refused to wear makeup because he viewed it as being not masculine and manly, and he did not do well. Interestingly, people who listened on the radio gave a slight edge in the debate to Nixon, but the people who watched on TV overwhelmingly said that John Kennedy won the debate, and he ultimately won the presidency in a very close election a few months later. In his inaugural address, one of the most famous lines was, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He was a firm believer and advocate of civil rights to a point. One of the things that helped him win, actually, was when Martin Luther King was jailed in the midst of the campaign, he called his wife and he sort of gave her his thoughts and prayers, and this led to more and more African Americans switching from their traditional place in the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, where they still remain today. He was also only the fourth president ever to be assassinated after Lincoln, McKinley, and Garfield. He was also sort of in the midst of the Cold War, a very firm believer that communism had to be stopped, that it would grow as long as people continued to be poor around the world, and therefore he established aid programs to help poor people around the world, principally the Peace Corps, for young, idealistic Americans to go to other countries and help to educate, to build schools, and to work there. He is also admired and revered by Democrats for his leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we will get to in a moment. But first, Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. Cuba had been taken over by a communist government dictatorship just before Kennedy came to power. And there was a plan on the part of America to not allow a communist country this close to Florida, as you can see here, and to sort of take over and help authorize an invasion at the Bay of Pigs, right here on the map. So Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. The previous president, Dwight David Eisenhower, had a plan to overthrow the new communist dictator, Fidel Castro, here on the right, in Cuba, by training a group of Cuban people who had fled Cuba after the takeover by Castro, to train them, to supply them, and to help them reinvade and to overthrow Castro, starting at the Bay of Pigs. When Kennedy became president, he learned of this plan. He expressed some skepticism, but agreed to continue the plan after the CIA and the Department of Defense persuaded and convinced him that it could succeed and it would help free the Cuban people from the dictatorship of communism and Castro. In April 1961, only 3 months after he became president, they invaded at the Bay of Pigs, and it was a disaster. They knew they were coming in Cuba. They were ill-supplied and ill-equipped, and when they called for reinforcements and for planes and for bombing, Kennedy said, "No, I'm not getting involved in an actual direct invasion. It's one thing if it's behind-the-scenes support. It's another thing if it's our planes and boats." Three consequences of this disaster. The president and the CIA had a rather tumultuous relationship. He felt that they had lied and misled him into the practicalities of the Bay of Pigs plan, and they felt that he had not properly backed and supported it. Latin America was increasingly weary of the intervention and the heavy-handedness of the U.S., especially in the midst of the Cold War, and Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, saw JFK as weak because of this aborted and ill-timed invasion of Cuba. One of the consequences was the creation of the Berlin Wall. Remember, and this should be review, West Germany was a member of NATO, and East Germany is under the sort of indirect supervision and control of the USSR. The former capital of Germany, Berlin, also split into East and West, was especially tense because although it's entirely surrounded by East Germany at this time, it is split into a free, more democratic Western half and a more communist, less free Eastern half. Khrushchev demanded that the troops who were in West Berlin leave. Kennedy adds more troops to support and to keep this part of Berlin free. By the end of the summer of 1961, relatively quickly, within a few days, the East Germans, with the help of the USSR, have built a wall splitting East and West Germany. The other complicating factor is that more and more East Berliners were leaving East Berlin and moving to West Berlin. And so to stop the flight of people and to sort of teach the West Berliners and the Americans a lesson, they built a wall that continued to exist until 1989. Here's the picture of the wall itself, and it got larger and more imposing over time. And then here is the picture of the protest from the wall that we will get to at the end of the year. Growing Cold War tensions lead to one of the more troubling and more terrifying incidents, the Cuban Missile Crisis. American spy planes track and find nuclear missiles being moved and put into place in Cuba, again, only 90 miles from Florida. JFK takes to TV and gives a speech to the country about what is happening. He conveys the fear and terror of this, and he determines that the USA will establish a blockade, and he promises to destroy any Soviet ship that attempts to pass through. I should note that this is prompted in part by the Americans putting similar nuclear weapons in Turkey on the border with the USSR. So it is not unprompted, but it is seen as a provocation by Americans and by Kennedy. He says that any nuclear attack from Cuba would result in the same response of America against both Cuba and the USSR. They negotiate, and the public perception of this is that Kennedy has stood strong, has stood tall, and has not backed down. And this, he has sort of proven his, worth and manliness by demanding the removal of nuclear missiles from Cuba, which they do. Behind the scenes, the Americans also agree to take out our weapons from Turkey, but they do not acknowledge this publicly, at least at the time, and still to some extent to the present day. But over these 13 days, this is the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war, but it is averted. And to avoid any future confusion and the possibility of war, a hotline, a sort of direct telephone communication is established between Moscow and the White House. Incidentally, in addition to sort of de-escalate tensions, both countries agree to not perform nuclear tests anymore. I'm Ultimately, President Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. There are different conspiracy theories and conflicting accounts. Most accounts at the time and still to the present day place the blame on a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had traveled to both Cuba and the USSR, although there's no direct evidence, at least publicly available, that he was backed or supported. There are also accusations and conspiracy theories that posit the involvement of the Vietnamese, which we will come back to, the mafia, the CIA, or even President Johnson here at the right, taking the oath of office. After becoming president upon the death of President Kennedy, President Johnson initiates a series of programs called the Great Society, or as he terms it, the War on Poverty. He began his career as a young man in Texas as part of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, and he initiates and continues a lot of the expansion and the programs that are in the spirit and in line with the ideals of Franklin Roosevelt. He passes the Civil Rights Act in 1964, saying any discrimination in a public place is outlawed. He passes Medicare and Medicaid, expanding healthcare options to the elderly as well as the poor. He passes the Voting Rights Act, saying that there cannot be poll taxes or exams, and guaranteeing by law all Americans, especially African Americans, the right to vote. The Immigration and Nationality Act finally does away with racial quotas, and it no longer gives priority to countries and people from Europe, and it opens up immigration to all places, including places in Africa and Asia that prior to this had been zero or very, very low numbers. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act authorizes new schools, school spending, school teaching, as well as preschool and Head Start programming. And the Housing and Urban Development authorizes public housing and housing for low income and working class Americans. However, all of these great programs by a Democratic president to help the poor and the needy are ultimately undermined by his foreign policy, principally the war in Vietnam. During World War II, Japan captures Indochina, as it was then called, a colony of the French that included parts of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. A communist nationalist leader, Ho Chi Minh, fought the Japanese, and by the end of World War II, Japan has surrendered, and France comes back and says, hey, that's cool, but we're going to take you back over again due to your natural resources. Again, thinking about the principles of imperialism. The Geneva Accords of 1954, after a war by the Vietnamese against the French, authorizes the splitting of Vietnam into two countries, a North communist and a South non-communist. There were supposed to be democratic elections, but the USA feared that Ho Chi Minh would win because of his popularity in leading the war against the Japanese, so the elections never actually happened. The USA was also clear that if the North attacked, there would be consequences. From 1955 to 1959, No Din Diem began to rule in the South. However, he ignored the Geneva Accords, did not hold elections because he thought that he would lose, but he did crack down on communism. In 1959, the Viet Cong, the communist sympathizers in the southern half of Vietnam, began an attack and an insurrection against the current president. Why did we get involved in a war halfway around the world? Well, the principal idea is the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls to communism, then other countries across the region will as well. More and more countries are going to become communist. Keep in mind the context here of the Cold War, as well as China being communist, as well as the Korean War, leading to the fear and paranoia of the spread of communism. There are some complications. At first, we support President Diem, even though he did not have the free elections, because he is a strong opponent of communism. But as more and more people in the country are opposed to him and his basically dictatorship, he becomes more and more extreme. He is Catholic, and he imprisons and killed those who are different, including Buddhists, some of whom protested by lighting themselves on fire. And we felt that we could no longer back Diem, authorizing basically a coup. that ended in his assassination in the fall of 1963, a few weeks before the assassination of President Kennedy. By November of 1963, we had 16,000 troops. All parties are still trying to negotiate a peace. There is increasing insurrection and attacks by the Viet Cong in the South, and the Department of Defense believed that we needed to send more troops to hold the peace and to defeat the communist insurrection in the South. Johnson is reluctant. But in August of 1964, we believe at the time that boats of the North Vietnamese have attacked American boats in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. There's some evidence both then and now that these were actually not attacks, that it might have been blips on the radar, or that they were actually other boats. But we take the opportunity to go to Congress and get authorization to send more troops. It is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. We escalate from 180,000 troops to 400,000 troops to 500,000 troops by 1968. This is the peak of the war, Operation Rolling Thunder. We dropped more bombs on Vietnam than dropped on all Axis countries combined during World War II. There was jungle, small-scale hit-and-run warfare called guerrilla warfare. It comes from the Spanish, and it means a small war. It is complicated by the thick jungle forest, swamp, and rainforest. We tried to alleviate this problem by dropping Agent Orange, a chemical to kill the plants and leaves and trees. That also has some rather negative effects on the people who breathe it in as well. There are also problems involving the war here at home. A counterculture movement, the baby boomers, teenagers, and people in their 20s believe that the war is not in our interest, it is not American, and they do not support the war. They are basically called people in favor of peace, or doves, as opposed to the hawks who are pro-war. Complicating this and leading to more youth involvement is the draft. At 18 years old, you are placed in a draft. It's basically a lottery where if they pick your number, you will be sent off to Vietnam. And this occasions massive protests and marches and signs and what have you. One of the most tumultuous periods during the war and during American history is 1968. President Johnson is upset and depressed about the anti-war movement, and he announces that he will not run for re-election. Dr. King is assassinated. Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, is going to be chosen to run for president, only he gets assassinated. There are riots in the aftermath of both of these things across the country, in towns and in cities. And finally, Richard Nixon wins election in 1968 by beating President Johnson's Vice President H. Hubert Humphrey, or Hubert H. Humphrey. The next year, another movement for equality and civil rights begins at the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village, New York City, June 28th, 1969. Gay and lesbian people at this bar are fed up with the harassment and the attacks by the police who come to the bar that night, and they have had enough. And they throw bottles and rocks at the cops, and the people come out into the streets, and this begins the movement for gay rights and gay and lesbian equality. 1960 ends in the year 1970. Obviously, ongoing war in Vietnam. It has spread into the neighboring country of Cambodia. More bombs are dropped in that country as well as Laos. These student protests are ongoing at Kent State University in Ohio. Kids are protesting. They call out the National Guard, and students are shot and killed by the National Guard for protesting and for being against the war. Thank you very much, and goodbye.